Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum student. Welcome to another lecture. Welcome to another method of what? Foreign language teaching. Remember that? Okay. So dear students, today we are going to start the method that we started last week. That was CLT, Communicative Language Teaching. So guys, how are you? How are you doing? How is everything? Good. We are working hard. How about other subjects, my dear students? You see, you are putting efforts. Good, good. You need to work hard. Only then you can get good grades, right? All right. You're right that sometime if you are a very good student and if you can prove yourself in the interview, then sometime your grade, may not have that value. But point is that these days you cannot apply for a job unless you have very good grades. And these days, in fact, every organization requires the minimum 3 CGPA, right? So keeping this in mind, you have still time. It's your third semester. And people who have low grades so far in the first two semesters, they can compensate for that, right? So work hard so that minimum you should have 3 CGPA. If you get more, it's good, but the bare minimum should be 3 CGPA. So that is not easy to get, of course, in this course, in the program that you are pursuing. So work hard for that, do your assignments in fact well, and submit them on time. Don't miss any quiz, don't miss any graded discussion. So only then you will be able to get good grades. Be in touch with your LMS, right? And whatever the announcement is, try to fulfill that. Is that clear? Fine. So today we are going to start what? A new method? No, not a new method, my dear students. Yes, fine. I just ask you to see that whether you would go with me or you would stop me there. But you stopped me here. Fine. So we started a method last week that was CLT, Communicative Language Teaching. So we will move on. Today's lecture is again on CLT. And we might spend a lecture more on this method because this is very important method, right? And this method is in these days, of course, if you see around these two methods, in fact, you will find around in the industry which two, direct method and again, of course, this CLT method. These two methods are in most of the organizations. They recommend this method for teaching. Either you are in the private sector, and again, some very good public sector institutions, they have started employing direct method for foreign language teaching. Is that clear? So, as usual, what to do? Yes, review the last lecture. So, dear students, let's come here. Yeah. What did we talk about in the last lecture? Okay, we talked about communicative language, CLT, teaching, or what else we call this method? The communicative approach. Fine. So what is it about? What does it say? That what? That being a TOEFL student, what do? We teach that foreign language. Fine. How? Why we teach? To have what? Good communication skills, to enhance communicative ability of the student. How? Through communication. So the goal is communication and the means also is communication. So the process is communication and the product is also communication. Fine. So our approaches are the methods, of course, is communicative approach. And what do you want to achieve? Again, communicative ability of our students. This is what CLT says. Fine. So we talked about that what are the bases of this CLT? Wilkins, right? That of course mean, what is it? Functional, notional. Remember that? So that is the basis, and also the theory behind. What is the theory behind this? Delheim's theory, of course. Which theory? Theory of communicative competence. And why did he give that theory? Of course, in resistance to Chomsky's linguistic theory. Fine. And what does Delheim says? He says that, well, of course, a child when acquires language, not only he acquires the grammar of that language, but also he acquires appropriacy. Fine. And what does appropriacy mean, my dear students? That, well, that child knows what to say, when to say, how to say, fine, and what not to say, fine. And even that child knows, in fact, that child acquires which expression to be used for elders, for youngers, and for friends, because, you see, so because the child has acquired that language. So this is what the Delheim calls it communicative competence, and Chomsky's what? Linguistic competence. So Chomsky's linguistic competence has some limitations as per Delheim's. Delheim says that, well, the Chomsky does not talk about what? Context, fine, situations, whereas here the Delheim's the theory, of course, which is behind this the communicative approach, talks about the social context, talks about the functions as well. Fine. So this is what we talked about, that what is CLT and what are the approaches behind this, what is the theory behind CLT, and we also talk about two types, of course, this communicative approaches. One, weak version, and second, strong version. The weak version is that, of course, you learn language for communication, and strong version is, of course, that language learning is for understanding, for learning. Is that clear? These two approaches, I mean, we talked about in the last week, and then we also saw that this CLT, the communicative language approach, is an approach that helps the learners to communicate in different situations, and that helps the learners to argue their viewpoint, helps the learners to persuade, right, to persuade others, help the learners to be more persuasive, to be more convincing, fine, to be more informative. So, right, a communicative, of course, communicatively, in fact, expert student, right, you could say, or in other words, I should say that the one, of course, if a student learns language through this method, through communicative approach, so he can adjust himself in different situations. He can communicate in different situations. So he, in fact, of course, I mean, he becomes independent, right? At different situations, he can, in fact, think of, and he can express himself well. Why? Because the teaching methodology is communicative approach, and this approach is, well, that, well, you see, to help the learners to communicate in the target language. And again, how we achieve that? Of course, by training those students, by teaching that language in the target language. And how we teach? Communicatively. So we teach that language communicatively, and again, what do we want to achieve? Yes, we want to achieve, I mean, good communication skills, so that the functions of the communication can be fulfilled, so that the learner could convince others well, so that the learner could negotiate, right, his of course with others well, so that the learner could mediate well, the learner could, in fact, ask for his rights well, and learner could do his jobs well. Is that clear? This was what we talked about last week, and then we discussed that CLT is what? Very simple, communicative language teaching. And we also call this method the communicative approach. And what was going on in the last class? You remember that? Yeah, the teacher enters and he uses target language. What he does? Yes, right? So how does he begin the class? You remember? See what happens in the class when the teacher enters? Yes, the teacher brings authentic material. Fine. So he distributes handouts. Remember that? And again, before distributing handouts, he greets the students. So there is greeting. Fine. And then he gives handout. And what was the handout about? Yeah, the teacher took that handout from a newspaper. So again, the handout was from football, right? Soccer. Fine. And then, I mean, there were different headlines, and it was a report, right, on the World Cup was going on. So then, of course, the report writer, in fact, that sport writer, he in fact gave his viewpoint, who will win the World Cup, and then of course the teacher asked the students their views, in fact, and he writes their proposals on the board. Fine. And then teacher asked them to give more linguistic items for that, more expressions for that. So in this way, interaction starts. In this way, communication starts. Students start giving their in fact proposals, start giving their assumption that who will win the World Cup, right? And then at the end, what happens? That we compare the students' views with the news reporter's viewpoint. Is that clear? And then, of course, they move on. That well, the teacher gives different activities in the class. The role plays are there. You see, there are different games are there. Fine. And of course, we see a strip story was there. So where there was continuous interaction throughout the class. So the continuous communication was there. So we saw, well, that a real communicative approach was in fact being used in the class. And of course, this is really a success for the method, that the whole class, the student, in fact, they do whatever they are supposed to, because they have to learn that language communicatively. They have to communicate in this language. So, but whatever the activities the teachers in fact help them do, and the students, in fact, the teacher just initiates activities, and then he let the students do those activities, and the students perform those activities, and they keep on communicating, which means that they are using the language, fine, and they are, of course, I mean, arguing with others, they are giving information, they are rejecting their views and all that. Is that clear? So this was all that we saw in the class, where 20, in fact, immigrants were there, and they have lived in US for last 2 years. So how was the method? Yeah. So you found the method. Yes? Yes, sir? All right. So you like the method. Good. Yeah, of course, it is the method which in fact highlights communication. So definitely people like this method, because once you enter the class and you start listening to that language, and then you have to communicate with your friends, with the teacher in that language. So learning starts, and the learner, of course, they like this method, because the learning starts the moment they enter the class. So there is interaction, there are activities, and all that. Fine. So we saw that this method can be compared with direct method, where the target language is taught in the target language. So here communication is achieved through communication. So that is what the process is, communication, and the output is communication. That's what we saw, that this approach in fact talks about what? Emphasizes on communication. That is the goal, and how? Through communication. So this is what we talked about last weekend. Fine? Clear? Any question? Fine, students. Okay, now here, what is communicative approach? Today we'll talk about the principles. Today we talk about the principles of this method, as we do, of course, whenever we talk about the method, we'll see the principles, and also see what are the principles, and we'll try to review these principles, fine, right after discussing all these principles. Is that clear? So, I mean, I hope the observations are in your mind. In the last lecture, what did we do? That I gave you observations and principles as well. Today I changed the approach, and again today I just brought principles. I want you to read the observations on your own, and if your text is in front of you, you can read observations and then see how this principle, how is in fact you see the principle is behind a visible thing, right? And why this observation is there, why teacher uses that activity, what is the principle behind. Is that clear? Do you understand? So what is the principle? That if you see, keep in mind the observation. What was their student? The teacher brings authentic material in the class. Now what is authentic material, by the way? Remember, the teacher brings a news report, in fact. And again the teacher brings news report on sports, on football. Is that clear? So that's why, of course, when you being teacher, when you bring authentic material, you can bring material from, of course, from the current issues, from the current affairs. Whatever the issue is, the hot issue. So in this lecture we see that the teacher brings a news report on football. So football World Cup was there, in fact. That's why teacher selected that. So the point is that whatever authentic material you bring, see, if you bring a very old material, right, then you have to see why have you brought that old material. They can be in fact the principle behind. But of course, ideally, if you bring latest material, in fact, and topic from the current issue, so that would really help the learner, right? And also that would help you, right? Because that is the language which is in, that is, of course, and you know the language changes, in fact. If you bring a material from 1995, so definitely, of course, the language then and language now in 2013. Is that clear? So that's why the language changes, and it's a good thing. The language should change, right? Language changes. That's why, of course, that language, of course, lives, in fact. So it's a feature of a language that it changes, and it should change. If a language does not change, so that is called a dead language. Sanskrit is an example, of course. So that's why language changes, and it's a good feature that language, has elasticity. Like our Urdu, for example, the Urdu that you and I speak, and of course Urdu that our parents used to speak, in fact, or our grandparents or our forefathers, they used to speak. There are some differences. Is that clear? Now we are in the age of IT. You have computer, you have the mobile, so definitely now you have different language items are there that we use. Is that clear? And you must have seen that some vocabulary items, the new words are coming and the old words are, of course, going out, fine, not in use. So when you use a word, that word remains in. Once you stop using that word, so you may not find that word. For example, computer these days, of course, and talking about desktops. So now you see that now people have, of course, started using laptops, and even your mobile is a computer. So maybe after some time you will see that these desktops would not be in. Fine. So once this desktop would not be in use, so this word might not be in, of course. Is that clear? There was a time that this computer was not in fact, the word was not there because this machine was not there. So once we saw that this machine, of course, people started using, so this word came into language and people use this word compute and computer. And then all the, of course, relevant vocabulary items, hard disk is there, motherboard is there, CD drive is there, in fact. So all hardware devices, they are words and we use them. Fine, you have example central processing unit, you have the monitor and all that. So once this desktop would not be in, so all these words would go out, for example. Is that clear? Now we talk about the laptop, we can talk about tablets, for example. Clear? So whenever the technology, of course, improves, the language also changes. So I was talking about this authentic material. That authentic material, of course, is in real context. The teacher brings authentic material, and that material is in exact situation, in real context. So, for example, sports column from a recent newspaper. So, this is again a message for us being a teachers, being a student of TEFL, that whenever we have to, take a handout for our students, you can choose, a material from, of course, the newspapers, and take a current issue from the new newspaper. So students would of course, and maybe students have already read that, so they would really of course do it well. If you use in fact an old material, so that would be difficult for even the students. Maybe that would be easy for you that you have done that material many times, but that would be difficult for the learners. However, it is not hard and fast. If you feel some handout is there which is very effective, so I mean you can of course explore many language items from that, so you could use. It is not hard and fast that you cannot use, but for the safe side, of course, for the betterment of the method, if you want to have the maximum result, so authentic material can be of course a good help. Is that clear? Fine. So this is the principle that teacher uses, authentic material in the real context. Like we saw that he brings the material and he gives the handouts, and before that he also greets the students, and again we see that well there is interaction, so communication begins. Fine. First he communicates, he greets the students, and then he gives handout to the students. So first principle is what? Authentic language in real context, very important. So that is what I mean, the student should be able to, again we see that communication. Of course the means is communication, and of course the product is communication. So if you use the real material and real material in the real context, fine. If you bring authentic material in your class, fine, and then the student would use that material and they would discuss that material. So it means, first of all, once they read that, they would come to know the language, of course. They would read that, and their understanding of this present language would be more, and they would be able to use that in the real life. So authentic material from the current affairs would definitely be a good help. Dear students, this was the first principle, that the teacher brings authentic material in the real context, and we saw that a column is there. Again, another principle is what? Ability to figure out someone's intentions, communicative competence, right? Again you see that, well, the teacher asks students to, fine, read that of course that column, and then of course in that column you see what happens, that the columnist of course has given his viewpoint. So now in fact the teacher asks the students to give their views. So they what? In fact teacher ask for their intentions, and what do they say, example. So in this way what happens, once the teacher asks for the students' intention, so again the point is, that is communication, so communicative competence, that they will be able to communicate. And once they will able to communicate, they will give their viewpoint. When students give their viewpoints, and of course their viewpoints might disagree with this columnist, so they enhance, they improve their communication, and definitely their communicative competence improves. That is the second principle. First one was authentic material. Second, intentions are asked. So in the underlying the message is communicative competence. A third principle is, my dear students, what? The language. See, it is a vehicle for communication, not the object of study. Again I tell you that of course, I mean, why we learn a foreign language? To communicate in that language, right? We need not to, I mean, know about the language, but we need to know how to use that language. Clear? So knowing about the language mean, that is of course knowing its grammar, vocabulary and all that, but knowing how to use the language, this is what the ultimate goal is, that we need to be able to communicate in that language. So language is a vehicle for communication, for communicating your ideas, for persuading your customers, fine, or for arguing your viewpoint. So this is what we see, that the third principle is what? That language is used, the target language is used, so, and of course communicatively, so that student would be able to communicate in that language, and that is the goal that we want to achieve. So first one, authentic material. Second one, see that, all right, intentions. Third one, language. The fourth principle, student, is what? Yes. Well, students, so one function of language can have many, in fact, different linguistic forms. So the goal is to convey many meanings, in fact, to convey meanings with many possible and suitable forms. Like we see here, in fact, that the teacher asks for the student views, in fact, how student would in fact say the statement again, right? For example, initially in the column we see that in fact that reporter, in fact the columnist, what he does, that he predicts, fine, and then the teacher asks the student to predict, in fact. So that's why one way is that you see the model is there, from that the authentic material where the columnist, in fact, he predicts, and then we see that teacher asks the students that they need to predict. So again, there are many linguistic forms of one function. So one function is there, one function can be one function of language, so can be in fact said in many forms. So again, this enhances communicative competence of the students. They don't rely only on the one pattern that we saw in audiolingual method, that one pattern is there and the student keep on repeating that pattern and they make their habit and they use that, and then they cannot, whatever expression they have learned, they would use that expression in a situation where that form may not help them, so they would be in trouble. So here we learn that of course we have to communicate in different situations, so we need to know what different linguistic forms for one function. So like we say that, I mean, it is possible that Italy would win or Italy may win that competition. Clear? It is possible that Pakistan would come out of economic crisis, or Pakistan may come out of economic crisis. So see the two forms of the same function. Clear, students? So first, authentic material. Second one, can tell me what is it? You see, I tell you, here mean ability. Then language. Here function. Fifth one, what is it? So language use at high levels. Again, this word supra-sentential or text or discourse level, in fact. Definitely, of course, I mean, language, purpose of language is to communicate, in fact, to have discourse, to have discussion. So definitely when you use the language for that purpose, so that is, we call it what? Language for the higher purpose. Maybe in the coming lecture we'll talk about the bottom-up approach and top-down approach of listening and reading skills. So when you talk about the bottom-up approach, you see things from the bottom to top, in fact. And when you see things from top to bottom, you see, for example, when you have a wall and you're standing at the wall, so you see down. You may not have a clear vision of the wall, but once you're at the bottom of the wall, you can see things, right? So here what the principle is that we of course we need to use language at high level. In fact, see example, what even we have to see. So I mean, if in speaking, what supra-segmental features, and then when you see the language, of course there are different, of course, the systems of language we need to know, and also the text level and also that discourse level. Clear, students? Fine. So we saw that once the students, what they are given some sentences and they of course put them in order. So this way, right, the principle behind is that they need to know what are the cohesive devices in the language and how can we use those cohesive devices, and what is cohesion and what is coherence. So these are, of course, we use that language for the higher purpose. Once the learner, in fact, is able to recognize, right, the linking devices of course linking devices in the language, and he comes to know what are the transitionary words in language, and he also comes to know that what are the cohesive devices. So that's, you see, again in this and then he will be able to communicate well. So that's why, of course, the teacher, what he does, that he asks the students to put some sentences into order, unscrambled sentences into scrambled form. Clear? That was the fifth principle. See, remember that the discourse or communication has three elements. One, the real communication mean information gap. Two, task-based activities. Three, meaningfulness. Remember that. Discourse, again, discourse mean what? Communication, right? You have business discourse, you have literary discourse. Maybe in the fourth semester you will have a subject that is stylistics. So over there you also analyze that, you may analyze a literary discourse, what? Linguistically. So discourse is what? That is this mass dialogue can be a discourse, in fact. Clear? So discourse or communication has three important elements. One, the real communication mean, what is that? The communication, that is information gap. What is information gap? Fine. Information gap is that if one person knows more than the other, fine, the teacher knows more and the student knows less. So there is what? Information gap. Communication gap may be a term that you might have heard somewhere. So when there is a barrier between the communicator and the communicant, mind you, communicator is a person who communicates and communicant is the one to whom he communicates. So communication gap or information gap, when one person knows more than the other does. And second is information gap is what? When psychologically two the persons, they cannot communicate with one another. So that is termed as what? Communication gap. Alright, so task-based activities, again the task is the job that you perform. So again that is the element of this communication. Again here I mean the task base is that what? Definitely you encode and your receiver decodes the message and then he encodes and you decode. So against task you speak and your listener listens, then he speaks and you listen. So it's a two-way process. So all task activities are there. And then what? Meaningfulness, that when you communicate a message and your listener gets the message, it means there is what? Meaningfulness. You see, whatever you want to communicate, if your listener in fact gets the same, in fact, the message, it means they are both are at the same page. This is what the elements of discourse or communication. And here in discourse analysis what happens? Cohesion means physical correctness. Fine, physical connectedness and coherence, connectedness in meaning. Is that clear? Physical connectedness, my dear students, that the linkers that you use. For example, we use these words moreover, furthermore, in addition to, on the other hand. Fine. So even when you write a message, write a discourse, or you communicate, so you use these what? Cohesive devices, and we call them physical connectedness, that you can see, for example, or when you write, you use these what? Linkers, these linking devices. So they are called what? Physical connections. And of course the logical one is, that is coherence. Fine. So how logical your thoughts are, that is what we call them coherence. And this is what language at the higher level that we talk about. This was the principle that language used at the higher level. Now the sixth principle is, my dear students, what is it? The importance of games as real, of course, communication. So again, it's a task-based activity, and again, it's a student enjoy it, fine, and then they play games and they are learning that language. So an activity which gives students fun, right, and they use their, of course, mind, and definitely they are communicating and they are learning the language, of course. And there is immediate feedback, ensure the learner of the results. In fact, once you have a game and you want your second group members to guess, right, who is there, right, or you give some clues to your other person. So through clues, second person tries to guess the personality. So what is it? Again, that you see there immediately you can see the feedback. Either you are giving the right clues, right, and the person of course gets the clues or not. So this one is that of course importance of games are really important because there is more communication, and again authentic communication you could say, and the learner thinks of course and he tries to communicate. Well students, so the seventh principle is that opportunities for self-expression. So here the students definitely, of course the purpose is communication. We discussed in the beginning that of course to achieve communicative ability through this communication. So here once we ask students for their experiences, so they reflect back. So opportunities for self-expression. Again, this shows that the students' feelings are dealt with positively. So we see here that students are able to express themselves well. So they are more expressive, and again they communicate their messages to their listeners. Another principle is, my dear student, that errors are natural outcome of the development of communication skills. So we see that definitely once there are errors in the language, so this is what a natural thing. And with the passage of time, these errors, of course, they are overcome fine by the students, and also the resource person can help them out. And it depends on how the resource person helps the students. Does he correct the learner there and then, or the teacher gives them correct version of that expression. Another principle is what we have a story, a strip story there. There are 5 pictures are given, and students have to join those pictures, fine, and students have to guess that which is the picture number 2, 3, 4, and 5. Fine. I mean, in a group of students work on that strip story. And again, why the principle is establishment of situations to promote communication. Of course, different situation is there. So again, I would say that you being creative teachers, you should think as many situations as you can. But in this method, of course, the underlying message should be that student would be communicating, and students' communicative ability would improve. So whatever game you think of or you design, if you are a creative teacher, you can do that. Fine. So mind you that creative mind always become a good the teacher. Creative mind, of course, definitely succeed in life. If you are creative in activities, you will be a successful TEFL teacher. You will be teaching foreign language successfully, but for that you have to work really hard. You have to observe things around, and you have to see the material around, and keep on thinking that what game can be made or what activity can be designed, and what is the principle behind that activity, so that student would communicate in the class. So we see here, a strip story is there. Please read the text for details. Next principle is, my dear students, cooperation, fine, and teamwork as a chance to negotiate meaning, right? There is cooperation and the teamwork. Of course, we see group work in this method. So what happens in that group work, my dear students? Yeah, communication there. Negotiation is there. In fact, students negotiate. They predict different situations. They give their viewpoints. Fine. They exemplify things, in fact, and they learn. How to face a tough situation. If I'm unable to guess what to do, in fact, or if my answer is somewhere else, how can I handle that situation? So definitely different functions, fine, and that is what students cooperate with one another, and they change their roles also. For example, a boss, at one time he's a boss, and another activity he can be employee. So again, the boss-employee relation, they can have discussion, or employee-employee communication, fine. So again, a peer-employee, a peon and employee communication. So see, but therefore, so that the learner would be able to communicate in various situations, so he would not suffer once he would learn this language through this way. Clear? And again, we see the role play as an example of social context. Yes, it's important that language for communication. So we learn that language in a context. So we cannot exclude context. Definitely, that the rhetorical theory also talks about that we always communicate in a particular situation. And if we exclude the situation, language may not work. Is that clear, students? Fine. Another principle is, my dear students, what? The language forms with respect to social communicative norms, right? Talking to you, exactly. Like I talked about this earlier, that well, whatever your norms are, if you're able to talk in different norms and different situations, so it means that you need different language forms for different situations. So if you are in fact good at communication, if you are communicatively strong, you can do that, and for different situations, of course, will help you to communicate confidently. So definitely, of course, and while designing activities, a teacher can think of many activities. For example, these days you see that we are in the age of information technology, and there are lots of jobs for computer science students. I mean, of course, lots of students are doing the MBAs, the BBAs, of course, the BCom, right? So in fact, the more private sector jobs are there. So that's why the teacher should be cognizant of these things. Teacher should know that what is going on in the market, and accordingly he can think of, he can design activities. Newspaper can be the best source. In fact, in newspaper there are different sections, and particularly the business section of the newspaper can be used for ESP students if the teacher is teaching business communication. So that is in fact important. And if you are, for example, teaching students for competitive purpose, definitely sometimes the students come to you, they need help for their competitive examinations. So for them, you can use editorials. In fact, you can use the columns of different people. So I mean, again, need analysis, of course, is important. But the point is, they see this communicative approach is important, because you see the approach, this method, in fact, improves our communication at a higher level of language also by using that language communicatively. This was the 12th principle. Another one is the teacher as an advisor, giving guidelines to the groups. Yeah, teacher guides the students, teacher advises the students, in fact. So the principle behind is that, well, they need to be somebody who guide, in fact. So and students need to follow those guidelines. Another principle is that a choice about what to say, mean linguistic competence and how to say communicative one. Fine, we talked about, Chomsky says, linguistic competence, what to say. I mean, content is important. And then here, the Delheim's theory, what communicative competence, how to say. Clear? So that is what we need to know, that what part, message, fine, and how, I mean, how to say that. I mean, how should I utter that message? How should I see my environment, and which function should I use? So what part again talks about the form. So Chomsky in fact talks about the form, and then Delheim's talk about what? You see, that is with which context you are talking, how to say, in fact. Fine. So that's why there is a choice, of course. The student learn also the use of the language, and they also they learn that how to have that language, how to know a form, and how to use that form in a different situations. So that is also a principle we have seen. The last principle, of course, of this method is that grammar and vocabulary from functions, situations, context, and rules. Yeah, we see in every the drill that we see, in every activity that we saw in this method. So the grammar is there, but it is implicit. It is not explicit. So there is no explicit teaching of grammar here in this method, and even vocabulary, of course, from functions, right? Again, we had a detailed discussion on the form and function. The student learn, in fact, the functions of the language, and all these things are there, are part of this class. But how? In situational context and different rules. So these were, students, my dear students, these were the principles of this CLT. Now quickly if I move on, so what is it? Yes, another principle is there. What? Listening to authentic language as homework. So at the end the teacher gives in fact the homework to the students. What does he say? Teachers ask the students to listen to authentic language as homework. For example, students can listen to a newscasting session, a newscaster. In fact, students can listen to a documentary, listen to BBC News in fact. So this is what their home assignment is there, that they need to listen in fact what? Authentic language, because they discussed that, they spoke on authentic language in the class, and then listening skill is also there. So the point is to be able to communicate well, and we know that of course to be a good speaker you need to be a good listener. So teacher gives assignment to the student that they need to listen to authentic language, and then for that teacher can assign them some activities as well. Alright, so dear students, now come to the TIQ. What is the TIQ? 10 important questions. Fine? Which important questions? 10 important questions that we will see this. Which 10 important questions, students? Alright, so very simple. Goals of the teacher using CLT. Right? What are the goals? Right? To develop communication. Very simple. Right? The name shows in fact communicative. So the goals of the teacher in fact to using CLT to develop communicative competence in the learner. Very simple. Fine. So communicative competence in the learner, form, meaning and functions are all critical in fact. Is that clear? Not only if that's mean to develop the communicative competence, so definitely is important. The form, fine, is also important. Meaning and then function. Right? All are what important to develop what? Communicative competence, the form of the language, function and also meaning. That is what the goals. Then the role of the teacher, you see, facilitator of learning process, manager of classroom activities, advisor and co-communicator. Is that clear? These are all what? The roles of the teacher. What are the roles, students? Facilitator of learning language. He facilitates them, right? Then he's a manager of classroom activities. He manages, and then he also advises. The man who manages and also gives advice. Fine. And he is a co-communicator. Now the role of the student in this method, student. What is the role of student? Yeah, of course the learner is a communicator. He communicates in fact and actively engaged in learning, meaning and responsible manager of social activities. So because definitely when the teacher assigns them some activities, so the student responsibly manage all those activities. Fine. So the role of the student is what? Communicator. Role of the teacher is what? To develop communicative competence in the learner. Fine. And then again, what are the characteristics of the process? Fine. Very simple. Usage and use are both important. Fine. See that, of course, the use is there. Usage of, you might remember that Michael Swan's, right, the grammar that talk about the usage, of course, how to use different language items. So usage and use are both important. Activities, role plays, problem solving tasks, games, or communication oriented. Well, students, so we see different activities in the class, and all these activities, my dear students, they are communication oriented. These activities help improve communicative ability of the learners, so which is very important element of this method. And you see that the information gap is a critical issue. In fact, a real interaction is made to exchange meanings, to reveal, make unknown information. And this is what we see, that in these activities you must have realized that at times you see there is information gap, and students learn how to help it, how to handle the situation when there is a communication gap, or how to help, of course, a situation where there is information gap. So through these activities we see that, well, at times there was information gap, at times there was communication gap. So yes, and these are the requirements, of course, for a good communicator when you have to communicate. So you face these things. So definitely these activities are there to help you overcome these problems that we face while communicating in the target language. So again, interaction in the class, we see the nature of the student-teacher interaction. Fine. What is it? Yeah, it is there, of course. Teacher talks to the groups. Fine. Initially, of course, he gives directions, but later, of course, he gives advices, and then he just observes, right? He manages things, of course. And the teacher is what? Initiator of activities. The interaction is basically student-student interaction. You see that less interaction there between the teacher and the students. Teacher just initiates, but the more interaction between students. So they interact through different activities. So we see that a teacher initiates and the students follow on. Then feelings of the students. Yeah, of course, the students' feelings are, here in this the method we see that they are, of course, students are more motivated. Fine. If they do something real and purposeful with the language. Yeah. So we see that once they in fact give their views, right? They predict, or they complete that story, that strip story, or in fact what they do, that they play the game, in fact. So they remain motivated, in fact. So these feelings are dealt positively. So throughout this class we see that student kept working, in fact, kept communicating. So obviously, of course, when you kept doing something, it gives you a sense of achievement. So it gives you a sense that you are doing a good thing, and of course you know that you are here for a purpose. You are here to learn the foreign language, and you are doing it, and you are doing it for the purpose that you are here for. When you have to communicate in that language, your purpose is to communicate this language, and you are doing it for this purpose, which means you are, of course, on the right track. And then again, teamwork and cooperation also fosters the feeling of security once they work in a team. So it also helps them, of course, to work well, and in fact this teamwork, in fact, helps the students to work well, and it gives them confidence, right? And the students feel more secure, in fact. They integrate L2 with their personality. How is language and culture is viewed? Yes, students. Here the language, for course, form, meaning and function. Yes, you see that the form, of course, language, the competence, form of the language, also meaning, semantic, and then functions are emphasized. Culture is part of real communication, the use of non-verbal behavior. Clear? So, of course, means that when you use the body language, so that is also, we see in the class that students interact, they negotiate, they play different roles, and they also incorporate non-verbal behavior or non-verbal communication. So important areas of language, yeah, functions over forms, right? Definitely forms are there, but priority is given to functions, and syllabus is functional, and a variety of forms are introduced in each function. Is that clear? Whatever the function is, right? The function, I hope you are clear about this function, that exact the use of the language, and also usage and use. Usage is what? That means what is the pattern, and use how to, again, the competence and the performance of the language that we see. So here, of course, how language is viewed, right, and what areas of language, you see that functions over form. Again, my dear students, the function is what? That definitely the use of language. When to give command is imperative is a function, for example, right, and when to request, again, it's a function, but that's what that sentence pattern is, the form. Fine. So students, in fact, know, because they have to communicate, they have to be communicatively strong. So they again, but they do consider form, but the point is their focus is on function over form, right? So at first easier functions are used to introduce easier forms. In general functions it determine form, not the other way around. You can have a look. Okay, so again see the students learn about cohesion and cohesive in real communication, not in an explicit way by scrambling and unscrambling the text. Again, I mean, if you teach students, for example, these cohesive devices about coherence, so it would be difficult. But if you do in this way, that I mean, giving them, of course, a model that we see in the class, and you ask them to unscramble them and again to scramble them, so they would learn, in fact, that what are the linkers, what are the linguistic devices, coherence devices, in fact, or cohesive devices, and what is coherence, fine, and teaching language at a higher level, of course, we see that. Role of L1, yeah, L1 has almost no role. Communication happens in L2, very simple. It resembles a direct method, no use of L1. Communication takes place in target language. How evaluation is accomplished? Yes, it's a good thing that, of course, both accuracy and fluency are evaluated. Fine, but definitely fluency has edge over what? Accuracy. One student have fluency, so they can overcome their accuracy. So that's why we suggest that fluency is given what? A priority. Accuracy comes later on. So the ideal learner is what? Is the best communicator. The use of form is not valuable by itself. Is that clear, students? So we see there is accuracy or, in fact, fluency. And who is the ideal learner? Yes, the one who, of course, he uses the form, right? But he also knows the function, the one who gives priority to function, of course. So students, this is what, in fact, about this lecture. Today is on what? CLT. Still, we are unable to complete the method. So far, we had 2 lectures on it, and hopefully in the next lecture, we will wind up the method, that is CLT. Very important method is there, my dear students, and it needs much discussions, right? The method needs more to be, in fact, highlighted. There is a lot is still there to be discussed. So we will see in the next lecture that we'll try to cover more important areas, and finally we conclude this the method. So with that, my dear students, we will be able to, in fact, complete our methods. That in the very first lecture we decided to have discussion on these methods, starting from grammar translation method to what? The last one, that is CLT. So today what we did, in fact, simple, that we reviewed first what is CLT, and then we talked about principles. We talked about 17-18 principles of this CLT, and then what we did after that, we reviewed all the 10 questions, very simple questions, TIQ we call them. See, the goals of the teacher, to develop communicative competence, then role of the teacher, fine, role of the student, then interaction, teacher-student interaction, we see, and then what? Characteristics of teaching learning process, then what? In fact, role of L1, no L1 here in this method. Then we see that how evaluation is done, fine. We saw that, of course, fluency is given priority over accuracy, and these are the questions that we try to answer. I hope you have an idea. I hope now you can, in fact, of course, after attending these 2 lectures, you are able to have this method in your class if you are practicing teachers, and if you are not, you may have an idea that if you have to in future, you can do it easily. With this, thank you very much. See you in the next class. Till then, it's Allah Hafiz.